people who took a holistic view and changed the system to enable Scrum teams had significantly more success. If I just tried to launch a bunch of Scrum teams and the entire system is fighting every move that they make. Also, we heard over and over again, sometimes this is really fragile. It became abundantly clear what would happen is Agile only existed, or Scrum at scale, because someone said it did. None of the policies were changed. People talk about the system snapping back when a new leader comes in. It's not that it snapped back. It's all the rules that were broken just started to be enforced again. So if you wanted it to last, you actually had to change the core mechanism and blueprint that the organization was built on.
Hey everyone, this is Dave, and I'm excited to have Matt Jacobs here today from Scrum Inc., and we're going to talk about the Agile operating model and how it can help with better ways of working. And before we get started today, I just want to give a disclaimer up front. I am a registered Scrum trainer through Scrum Inc. This episode is not sponsored by Scrum Inc. I retain full editorial rights, etc. So with that out of the way, I want to introduce Matt Jacobs. Matt, please introduce yourself to the folks.
Yeah, so I'm Matt Jacobs. I'm the chief product owner of the consulting group here at Scrum Inc. And really, over the years, we've been bringing Agile back to its original home, which is really how do you create the best engine to deliver your organizational strategy? And that's why Scrum was originally invented. That's what Agile was originally invented to do. It was to actually allow, especially people who are running organizations like Dr. Jeff Sutherland, the operating model required to be able to deliver the large projects they were trying to bring to life. It wasn't to do all these ancillary benefits. It was, at the end of the day, the best way of organizing to get something done.
And so how does a company called Scrum Inc. become interested in operating models?
Yeah, so my background before joining Scrum Inc. comes from a more traditional consulting background. I did a lot of post-merger integration, so bringing two organizations together, post an acquisition, or helping separate them. So if it was into get two separate organizations. And a core part of that is actually looking at the different layers of the operating model, from where are the boxes, how do the people, but also what's the governance and policy, what are the ways of working, and what are our levers to drive the culture that we're looking at. So that was always my point of view. When I came in and started talking to a lot of customers about what was working for their Agile transformations, one of the things that was really apparent is people who took a holistic view and changed the system to enable Scrum teams had significantly more success. If I just tried to launch a bunch of Scrum teams and the entire system is fighting every move that they make, they failed. Also, we heard over and over again, sometimes this is really fragile. It was really dependent on one big, strong leader to hold the whole thing together. To me, I found that really confusing. And when I started to look at it, it became abundantly clear what would happen is Agile only existed, or Scrum at scale, because someone said it did. None of the policies were changed. None of those teams were official in org charts. None of it was real. It was soft. So people talk about the system snapping back when a new leader comes in. It's not that it snapped back. It's all the rules that were broken just started to be enforced again because it didn't have the same type of air cover. So if you wanted it to last, you actually had to change the core mechanism and blueprint that the organization was built on. So to do an Agile transformation, it was really just an operating model transformation at its core, but aimed at something very, very specific.
So let's dive deeper. What is an Agile operating model?
I think first, even going further back of like, what is an operating model is probably
Okay,
the
let's
best
start
place
there.
to start. An operating model is the blueprint for how your organization delivers its organizational strategy. There's lots of different frameworks for defining an operating model, from people, process, technology. It doesn't really matter. The way we look at it is a couple different steps that I started by mistake to describe before, but what is my organization's mission? How does it uniquely create value? What products and services does it use to create that value? Are we then organized to deliver those products and services? Do we have the right governance and policies to support that structure? Do we have ways of working to support the governance and policies? And then do we have the right technology and culture to support all of that? So as we look at it, it's end to end. An Agile operating model, same components, But for us, focus is on a few different levers that make it a bit different. First, an agile operating model really needs to be prioritized on customer driven value from one to N. And that's from the top to the bottom. So we talk a lot about the golden thread. So this is what the organization finds important. How's that important for my business unit? How's that important for the layer underneath that to my team? So every single person knows what is the most important to the organization and how they contribute to that. And that is based on customer value. The second is the organization is designed to deliver iteratively. This isn't just a product development concept, but I also actually have to be a very modular organization to do that. Because if I have tons of coordination dependencies, I can't actually deliver rapidly through increments. So my entire org chart and policies also need to be set up to deliver in rapid increments. And then the last component is an acknowledgement that every operating model is not perfect. And even if it was for a moment, it will eventually not be because the world's changed. So you've built continuous evolution into the core organizational governance so that the model itself is constantly evolving. So hopefully, when you do this type of transformation, it's the last transformation that you ever do because you're constantly evolving from then on.
So, what about organizations where we already have Scrum teams, maybe even doing Scrum at scale? Like, how does this connect with an agile operating model? How's it come into play?
So it depends where you are on the journey. But say you have a bunch of Scrum teams that are working and things are going well. I would start immediately doing workshops with those teams of what needs to change for this to work and start having them identify kind of where's their friction with the current operating model and develop an organizational growth backlog. I also think it's incredibly important at the top of the organization, the leadership level, that they're already in position to start to identify what's important to the organization and have a mechanism to drive that alignment through and get the feedback back from the rest of the organization and a mechanism in place to drive that continuous improvement and start to look, all right, at my team or my team of team level, where do I have dependencies? Where do I need to start shifting around organizational capability to start to create that modular based structure? So you don't have to clean slate, but let's step back and actually start to try to make this official and make the system work for the people who are delivering the value.
Yeah, and delivering the value. So, as I'm hearing this, it's how do we connect the output of the teams to the outcomes that the organization, the customer is looking for, right?
Yeah, and delivering that quickly while also acknowledging it's not going to be a linear path to get there. So the best way we're going to do that is by rapid increments and learning.
And so, who is the agile operating model for, or maybe who isn't a good candidate for agile operating model? What are the constraints there, the bounds?
So I think that's a interesting question. I think you could say, and it would be a little bit of an easy answer, it's for anyone. I would refine that slightly to be if anyone who owns a system,
Okay.
end to end, who has some control of that in the organization. So this doesn't have to always be from the C suite down. If anyone has control of their local system, if that's an office, an individual factory, a larger product team, they can start to align their components, the pieces of the operating model that they can control, and look at, all right, where do I have friction with that operating model with the way I'm trying to get people to work?
And this could be also where maybe that is a good candidate. You start with a department, a group, whatever, and then as you start to see results, you start to grow that out inside of a medium or larger size or enterprise.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who work kind of with Scrum at scale or many of the different agile scaling frameworks know they're very fractal. Like a Scrum team and a Scrum of Scrum looks relatively the same but bigger, and the next level out looks like the same thing. Our view of transformation is also fractal like that as well, where the first thing you're going to want to do is at the top of the system that you control, get alignment on, all right, what are our design principles? What are the different products in it? How do we create value? And then we wouldn't ever believe in a big bang transformation. That would be oddly ironic for an agile approach. No, we want to do this through iterations. The way we find the iterations are individual components of that system, standing them up one at a time, learning as we go. So if you started all the way at the top of a 100,000 person organization. It's that same thing, but actually you're running transformations within transformation within transformation, following a very similar path.
Now, you mentioned Scrum teams. Does every team need to be a Scrum team in the Agile operating model?
No, we do think that's a great way for teams to deliver. One of the first times that we actually did this and the organization was not interested in Scrum is actually a really interesting story. So the organization, they actually were doing viral research. So it wasn't even IT development. A couple of the bench scientists started doing Scrum. They loved it, thought it was interesting. They really wanted their organization to adopt Scrum. And they'd been pushing on their leadership for a long time to get some Scrum training, get some Scrum consulting, and scale it across. As we talked to their leadership team, they're like, we have issues with organizational prioritization. We have issues with system dependencies. We have issues with scaling best practices across. I don't understand how what the bench scientists are telling me Scrum could possibly help my problem. And my answer was, can't. That's not going to help you. They then turned around and said, actually, we think the bench scientists are actually fairly effective. We don't care if they do Scrum or not. So actually with them, they were one of the first organizations we worked with. We're only interested in an agile operating model. They weren't going to stop anyone from adopting Scrum. And if you think about it, if I have empowered teams, they should be able to figure out how they want to work anyways. So if they don't want to work as a Scrum team, great, they can work in their traditional ways. But are they delivering what the organization is saying is the next organizational increment? If they're performing, who really cares?
And it's about the communication and coordination, whether you're doing Scrum or not. You still have to work with other groups, other teams, the larger organization. How do you communicate and coordinate, right?
Yeah, as long as you're participating in the system and working against the standard APIs and nodes into the other parts of the system, I shouldn't
Mhm.
necessarily care then how you're organized in that box. I happen to believe a great way to organize in that box is a Scrum team, but they're totally separate questions to me.
So, with all this, how does an organization get started with the Agile operating model?
So I think any operating model change, if you want to go from a project to a product based structure, or if I want to go from an onshore to offshore, it doesn't really matter. The number one way operating model transformations fail is they have doing it because of the buzzword, whatever that transformation is. So the first step of any team is understanding what are we trying to change, and more importantly, why. So when we're working with a lot of organizations, we actually do an assessment of how well does the system perform today, and then turning around and saying, all right, this is where we are today. What do we want to change and why? And then working with that organization to understand components of the agile operating model, other leading practices and organizational structure to define some design principles. Design principles are simple tests that for every decision I'm making, does that align with the design principles or not? Because we find when organizations hit friction, like should this team be here or there, it's an emotive decision. And usually they're not talking about that. It's actually about a higher order friction. Like, oh, should we be organized by function or by product? By defining design principles, I can always come back to the design principles as the test and talk about the higher order issue that I'm probably having, not the micro issue that it's actually just a symptom of a higher order disagreement. Once I have that, I can then start to move forward and design experiments to start to move into the operating model I want to be, testing and learning as I go. Am I moving towards the North Star that I defined?
Is that North Star or the why you mentioned about, why are we doing this? Do you see that companies are seeing threats on the horizon and that drives the why and the need for it, or some other force factor that is driving the need for this?
I would say there's a lot of different whys, and it's very different depending on the organization, and it needs to be unique to them. I would say if you kind of step back and looked at kind of our mega issues, it's usually different flavors of the same thing. One, we're not going fast enough. We've got a lot of work in progress.
Delivery.
Delivery. Another one's our customers are unhappy or my employees are unhappy. Usually it's some sort of issue that they're facing that have make them step back and question. I think AI has now also accelerated this, which is, all right, how do I better leverage AI? Which in itself, that's a tool looking for a solution. But at the same point, it's hard to leverage AI, which gives me much faster cycles by definition, if the entire operating model is based on long, slow cycles. So, how do I actually incorporate the ability to the value that AI could create into my operating model? A lot of times that triggers other changes down the rest of the system.
So, what lessons and what best practices are you seeing to get to this target state?
I think a couple best practices. The first and foremost is always coming back to the why. I can't, and I'm as guilty of this as anyone. You start going down to the path, you have individual steps that you wanted to take action on, not stepping back and constantly coming back to why are we doing this? Is what we just did moving us in that direction or away from it? And stopping things that aren't working, double down in what they are, and leading the communication, not with the how, but with the why we're doing this and what it's going to accomplish. The how should be totally secondary to most of my communication. So that's the first one. I think the second thing that we see a lot of organizations do is lose people along the way who haven't been part of the journey. Oh, we're going to make all these changes. And they've gone through the learning, they've gone through the experience, they've worked through many different iterations of the organization. So they intuitively, it makes perfect sense to them, but it's not going to make sense to the other person. You're just giving them a solution, but they've not gone through the whole journey with you. How do you more rapidly than it took you the first time bring them along the same journey? And I think the last is not learning as you go. So I know there's a journey. Things aren't going to be perfect. No one gets this on the first shot. Humans are extraordinarily complex creatures. Combining humans makes a really complex organism. You're going to have unintended consequences. So stop trying to guess at everything up front. Let the organization start to tell you what needs to change and evolve once I get the top level structures and the minimum viable structures in place. And then I can learn about where I really need to focus, what I need to continue to evolve on. And then there's no end because your organization is a product in and itself. It's a system used for delivery. That can always get better. So how do I continuously looking at it so that everybody in the organization isn't working around the system? Instead, they're constantly evolving the system to work for what they're trying to do.
So, this is great. Change management. So, for example, there's different models like ADKAR, et cetera. Is that also a part in implementing an agile operating system?
Well, if you think about it, it is all human change. So, what's going to kill any organizational transformation is having a bad change strategy to go along with it. Is there a specific framework that works better than the others? I think sometimes with any framework, coming from a company called Scrum Inc., if you start putting the framework in front of what you're trying to accomplish, you're going to run into trouble. I think having one at least gets people on the same mental model of what they're trying to do. But your goal isn't to optimize Carter or AdCart. Your goal is to actually drive the organizational change. So if that becomes important, using those as tools to help you to get there is extraordinarily important. And being purposeful about the how, and if a framework helps you do that, great.
Right. And not, I think, as you've been mentioning, right? If you lead with the practices without explaining the principles or the why behind them, that's not a good,
Yeah. Or if you become a slave to your own framework.
right. So then what lessons out of agile product development can we apply to transformations?
I think all of them, if you look at the organization like a product in self and you actually bring up the Agile manifesto and start checking off individual items, they're all going to perfectly align to how we would view to run a transformation, like build it around motivated individuals. The only thing that is value is things gotten to the end customer. So, like a new policy that hasn't been deployed, a useless iteration. I'm going to try to make data driven decisions. So, the best way to get data about if this is going to work is actually doing it and seeing what data then I end up getting out of it.
Right. Running experiments, seeing what works, MVP, minimal viable process, product.
Yeah. And if you even step back to like also, how do you give the most room for freedom kind of within it? So, like, you start to get, if you're kind of in an agile operating model, one of the pieces been playing around with are principle driven policies. And a principle driven policy, kind of like listing all the rules, it says, this is the outcome. These are the principles that you should follow. Here's some sample processes to be able to do it. Because a lot of organizations have very, very strict policies and people will follow all the steps. They don't know what it was supposed to deliver. So what was the outcome that I wanted? And or could do it and know it's not going to deliver the outcome because the context specific. So if you lead, this is what I need you to achieve. Here are the principles which we're really going to hold you accountable for that you actually followed. And here's some sample practices that normally work to be able to achieve these principles if you haven't really done it before or you're not really sure where to start. That's good enough.
And it avoids the check in the box mentality, I think is how I'm interpreting this, right? Because if you understand the why, the principles behind it, you also have freedom, but you know what the outcome is expected of that, right? And so we're aiming for the outcome, not just the output.
It also gives, from an organizational construct, the ability for people underneath them to iterate and go outside the box. What you can hold people accountable for is either you delivered the outcome
Hmm.
or you followed the principles. And if the person broke one of the principles and has no strong explanation of why, then we've got a problem. You're not holding them together to individual process steps, but you can have a fairly fair conversation on you didn't get to the outcome and you didn't follow the principles. What's wrong?
So thank you again for the time today as we wrap this up. Is there anything else you want to share, or how can people get a hold of you and Scrum Inc. to learn more about the Agile operating model?
Yeah, so feel free. We've got a lot of thought leadership on scruminc.com. Feel free to email me at matt.jacobs, Jacobs, at scruminc.com. This is clearly a passion project for me and love actually creating systems that deliver what your organizational strategy is. Would love to help or just hop on a phone and talk to you about what's going on, what's your thought process, and if there's anything we could do to help or just give you a nugget to think about that could help you move forward.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the time today, Matt. And folks, please comment, reach out to Matt. Let me know what you think. And again, betterwaysofworking.com for more information on our content. And we hope you have a great day. Thank you very much. Take care.
Perfect. Thank you.